Welcome y'all formally to the Cozy Homes webinar, Staying Safe and Engaged in the Fossil Fuel Era. I'm very excited to see y'all here. And I know that some of you just joined, so you're wondering who the little dog is, which is clearly one of the more important topics to discuss. I'm kidding, but this is my dog Nessa, and I like to show her off whenever possible. But because we have quite a bit of conversations to have today, let's go ahead and jump right in. I wanted to start with this particular quote that came up recently in some readings that I was doing, which is that any serious conversations about energy policy will have to consider not just the technical questions of supply and production, but also the cultural, notice that it's bolded, and ethical questions of demand and consumption. History can contribute to that conversation and many others by reminding us that nothing about modernity ought to be taken for granted. Part of the reason that I wanted to pull out this particular quote for this conversation is that we're going to have a conversation that spans not just the technical pieces of it and the public health pieces of this gas stove moment, but really the aim is to really contextualize this moment that we're in, particularly around the cultural pieces about why this can often feel like a hard conversation to have and how we can move forward with this. The intention is to recognize that whenever we're kind of grappling with this, moving away from an old paradigm, an old energy economy, it's going to be hard. And so we want to surface some of those questions because we know a lot of folks are hungry for having that type of conversation with their neighbors, their peers, and also are eager to, translate that conversation into actual action. So thank you for joining us on this journey. But of course, first question is always, who's the other person in the Zoom room? Why is she talking? So I'll formally introduce myself at this particular moment. For those of you that I haven't met before, that this is the first time we're interacting with, my name is Michelle Pignon. I use she, her pronouns, and I'm based in Los Angeles. And as always, I like to tell a little bit of story about how I ended up in this side of the Zoom room. So I want to tell you in particular about the tortilla flip rite of passage that I experienced. I grew up in Los Angeles. My parents are both immigrants from Mexico. And one of the things that I remember very distinctly as a little kid is being absolutely mesmerized by how all of the elder women in my family would just so seamlessly flip tortillas directly over the flame. And so for me, seeing that and being mesmerized and really impressed, the act of cooking and the act of actually being able to put your bare hand directly over the flame was something that I associated with being an adult, with being a mother, with being somebody who cared for the community. So of course, one fateful day when I was in my 8 to 9 years old, my mom actually allowed me to do it for myself. And to this day, it's a little thing that I like to do in, be able to present and show off amongst my friends that I'm able to handle the fire directly over my flame. That being said, we're having a conversation about the dangers of gas stoves. And I wanted to start with this particular story to help kind of contextualize how complicated and oftentimes paradoxical our relationships with these appliances is. Because on the one thing to consider throughout is that food and cooking in particular is culture. It's a deeply personal act. It represents care, survival, and for many people, it's an act of love. So when we're talking about gas stoves, we're really talking about the entry point for food and for expression of culture. And we say this not as an excuse. It'll become very clear that it's definitely not an excuse, but rather as a thing to name and to keep in consideration as we consider and discuss how fossil fuel companies have weaseled their way into our kitchens and how we get to the point where we can actually convince other folks to join us in this journey. Now, I want to intentionally say and name that this conversation is hard. It's difficult. That's the beauty, the frustration of nuance in this moment that we're in. The kitchens that we have in our homes don't happen by accident. Our homes themselves and our cooking customs are deeply influenced by both tradition and capitalist markets. And our relationship to gas stoves varies substantially by geography. I know we have quite a few folks calling in from Canada, also quite a few folks who are calling from rural places. Their relationship to gas stoves can look substantially different from those of us in West Coast cities, such as myself. We also know that there's many places in the world, consider a place like Mexico, where gas is actually bought by the day, where people have a very intimate experience of holding the gas canister, going over to the stove and actually monitoring their usage throughout the day. And then we have other places like the Pacific Northwest where gas is relatively obsolete for apartment buildings. And so gas appliances are actually something of a luxury, and that the fossil fuel industry has put some money into that. So we say that intentionally to kind of surface that this is a hard conversation to have. And part of the reason we wanted to have this webinar is to have that conversation, because it's only by tackling those pieces that we can get some real nitty-gritty moments of inspiration and also ways of talking to the politicians that ultimately have responsibility for changing and dictating our future. So with that, I did want to mention that we have the chat open for folks to kind of drop in particular comments or questions, and we'll be monitoring those throughout the course of the webinar. So if you have a question, we do have a section towards the end. We do ask that folks kind of recognize that this is a hard conversation and people's relationship to cooking, to their stove, their financial situation varies quite a bit. So we ask folks to kind of be open to other perspectives and also lead with some curiosity. And did wanted to note that if there is something that we feel is a little sticky, we'll do our best to kind of address it in the chat or talk private message. But of course, we ask folks that, be civil and kind to the rest of the folks on this webinar for now. So without further ado, I thought that's my little piece. Now I wanted to hand it off to Erica Lozano-Bull, who is with Mixto Communications and also a volunteer for the Safe Organizing Network at Stand.earth. And I have asked Erica, with all her communications, wizardry, and expertise, to tell us about how did we get here. So Erica, off to you.
Hi, everyone. Thanks so much for being here tonight. I'm really excited to do this with Michelle. So I'm going to do a little historical dive into gas. And just a quick aside with my history, like Michelle, I'm Mexican American, and the tortilla rite of passage. Today, I was making a quesadilla for my daughter on our induction stove, which we just got over Christmas, burnt the tortilla, and then I was like, I'll just throw another one on oh, wait a second. Had to change pans. It was a little bit wild. So it does change things. So, fossil fuel gas, which, I say fossil fuel gas because that's what it is, right? They want to call it natural gas. That's a misnomer. It's not new. Organic matter from the past 550 million years has broken down, and that's what we have. But in terms of humans, as far back as 2000 BC, in different countries from Iran to Indonesia, Italy, Azerbaijan, they were seeing these, what they called eternal flames. It was gas seeping from the ground that was likely hit by lightning. And then those became part of like religious and cultural beliefs and practices. 500 BC, actually going back 1000 BC in Greece, the shrine of the Oracle of Delphi was actually built on a chasm that was seeping gas, and a goat herder, his goat fell into it and started acting weird. So then when he went near it, he realized that he could see the past and the future. And so they built a shrine on it, and the Oracle basically would huff fumes and have hallucinations, and those were her predictions. So I thought that was a really kind of an interesting use for fossil fuel gas. 500 BC, China was building bamboo pipelines to move gas so that they could boil seawater. And that was both to make water that was drinkable and also to make salt to sell. So a long human history here with this. So we understand this is a big change for humanity. But coming into the modern era, it was really the 17 and 1800s where we saw gas use starting to be widespread. Mostly it was street lamps in Britain, Canada, and the United States. So that's where people were. Stoves were actually using coal and wood. In a lot of rural Canada, it was kerosene. So at that point, it just wasn't a big piece of who we were. But by the early 1900s, gas stoves started becoming more common in the US. In Canada, it was actually electric stoves that were on the rise. Canada has a little bit of a different history with natural gas than us in terms of where it's used and how it's used. But gas stoves have been popular in England for a long time. 1860s, London's Great Exhibition of 1851 actually showcased the gas stove. So they come here in the early 1900s, and then there's a kind of a rise. There's a lot of sales around getting natural gas into people's homes. By the 1920s, gas stoves were in almost every American kitchen. They were smaller and lighter than coal stoves. They were cleaner. They didn't need to be constantly heated. So people were really, women who were homemakers at the time were actually really excited about that. And interestingly enough, there were environmental concerns back then around coal stovetops. In 1911, Popular Mechanics actually ran a story about the effect of combustion coal on the climate. So again, not a new conversation. I saw a lot of vintage advertisements and stories about door-to-door sales at this point, targeting, again, women, housewives, pushing the convenience and attractiveness, easy to clean gas stoves, enamel gas ovens. And then by 1930, 14 million US households were cooking with gas, a slogan that originated in the 1930s, invented by an American Gas Association PR man, who then worked with folks who wrote radio scripts and slipped it in to shows with Bob Hope and Jack Benny, which popularized the slogan, which is still used today. All through some good PR. I have to say, fossil fuel gas PR is their strength. After World War II, there was a lot of advancements in metallurgy and welding, and then there was a post-war building boom. So gas pipelines, the construction just went through the roof. And all those pipelines gave opportunities beyond gas stoves. So then you start seeing a lot of water heaters and home heating using fossil fuel gas. And by 1970, 50% of American homes were using gas to heat their homes. In 1987, the United States had not quite 48 million residential gas consumers, but by 2021, almost 72 million, a 51% increase. So clearly this is good news for the fossil fuel gas industry. Today, half of US homes are using fossil fuel gas for space heating, water heating, and about 40% of US households use gas cooking appliances. There's a growing interest in electrification for environmental and economic reasons, but the gas industry has a really vested monetary interest in keeping us hooked on fossil fuel gas. So they are really happy to use gas stoves as a wedge issue. Next slide, Michelle. So we're going to talk a little bit about how this conversation got so fraught and why. So I'm going to start off, and then I'm going to hand it off to Michelle. I'm going to talk a little bit about the built-in inequities of our communities. And Michelle touched on that a little bit when she talked about rural versus urban, when we talk about where you live in the country or what country you live in, whether you rent or own. All of those impact how you might view gas stoves and how you may or may not be able to make any changes. So gas stove hookups in rental units are the default in most states, not all. So renters in general don't have a lot of say about whether they can use fossil fuel gas for cooking or not. And 40% of US households are cooking with gas, but that number goes to between 60 and 70% in 4 states, and that's New Jersey, California, Illinois, and New York. And when I talk about the ties between inequities, California and New York have the highest percentage of renters in the country, 45 and 47%. So you can see how sometimes the usage is really tied to home ownership or rentals, what your ability is to make those decisions on your own. And to layer on top of that, nationally, the median rent has risen nearly 35% since 2012. So we're also talking about, people who might want to be homeowners struggling to even be able to do that because of the rising cost of rent, which as you're paying rent, you can't save to own a home. So there's a lot of built-in things there. So it shouldn't be a surprise talking about these things to tie this to the fact that the gas industry is really, really interested in multifamily dwellings. In 2016, ICF International did a report for the American Gas Foundation, and they were really pushing hard for that shift to multifamily dwellings. So in the previous decade before the report, multifamily construction went from less than 25% of new construction to 1/3 or more of new builds. So a growing share of the market. And the report noted that makes this part of the sector significantly more important for policymakers working toward clean energy legislation. We're seeing that start to play out, right? So as multifamily construction continues to grow steadily, the fossil fuel gas industry is really desperately trying to keep municipalities from banning gas hookups in new construction. But aside from the rental market and rental multifamily units, I should really note that even for homeowners, the expense of changing from a gas stove to an electric stove can be super prohibitive. So gas and electric ranges can actually be really comparable in price. If you're going to buy a new stove, if you just needed a new stove, you can actually get things right in the same range of price pretty easily. But if you're currently using gas, switching fuel sources can require capping a gas line. So unless you know what you're doing, you need to call and pay for a plumber. Adding an outlet specifically has the capacity for your electric oven or range. And again, so that's hiring an electrician. You might even need to upgrade your electrical panel because they draw a lot of power. And so all of those things add up. It's not just the cost of buying a new appliance. Induction cooktops, as I have learned as a recent convert to the induction cooktop, can also require special pots and pans. They have to contain iron or have magnetic properties. And so you might have to buy new cookware. And that was actually the case for us. We had a few pots and pans, thank God for my Dutch ovens, but we actually needed to go out and get a couple of pans because we just didn't have anything. And then I think the most important thing to think about is honestly, not everyone can afford to just stop using something that works, right? Like a gas stove, and then purchase something new, like an electric stove, especially if that's several $100s at a minimum, right? So I think when we have this conversation, there's a lot of layers to it that are sort of ignored and dismissed by a media that really focuses on upper middle class or wealthy Americans when they're talking about making changes like this. We should also talk about in Canada, I realize there aren't rebates, but here in the US, you could get a rebate for changing to an electric stove or oven, but it can be super confusing. We have a link that's going to be dropped in about Rewiring America, but it's really confusing to determine whether you're eligible or not and how it's going to be applied. Is it going to be a refund? Is it going to be a tax credit? Is it based on your income? All those things they just make it a lot more difficult for someone to make a decision on their own to go ahead and do things. And then we move into the even broader issues of environmental injustice that underpin this discussion. I was reading through a 2017 study by the NAACP and the Clean Air Task Force. Black Americans are 75% more likely than white Americans to live in what's called a fence line community. And what that means is living next to commercial facilities with noise or smells or odors, traffic, or emissions that directly affect the population and their health. More than 1 million Black Americans live within a half-mile of oil and gas wells, processing, transmission, and storage facilities. And that doesn't include oil refineries. And we know, science tells us, toxic air pollution from fossil fuel gas plants exacerbates asthma, which affects 13.4% of Black children nationwide, compared to 7.3% of white children. So you might have seen a recent study that 12.7% of childhood asthma cases are caused by gas stoves, and children in households with gas stoves are 42% more likely to experience asthma symptoms. So you can see how the inequities can really quickly just pile up one on top of the other. I'm going to turn it over to Michelle for this next part.
Thank you, Erica. As always, when you talk, I learn new things. And even though I'm in this space, I'm also like, oh, I didn't know that particular fact. But as Erica's kind of doubling down on, part of the thing that is so tricky about this is that we're not operating in a vacuum. We are very much dealing with the things that we've inherited from the past, and we're having to figure out a new path forward. And that involves tackling a whole bunch of messy pieces of it. The other thing that I've already alluded to is that a lot of us have deep cultural ties to cooking with flames. It's worth acknowledging and respecting how deeply personal those ties can be, and recognize that it's going to be quite a lift for us to figure out and make the transition to how do we cook our favorite dishes like the tortillas? How do we heat up the tortillas without having to run through a whole stack of them? but then also recognizing the ways in which, if we allow this conversation to kind of stay at a surface level, what has tended to happen, unfortunately, with a lot of the renewable energy work so far is that it's only the benefits of it have disproportionately only been for higher income communities. How do we make sure that in positioning these solutions, we also acknowledge as those communities who are already feeling the really substantial impacts, the cumulative impacts of these issues? So with that comes a recognition that sometimes that means recognizing and acknowledging the difficulty of reinventing the cuisines. For me in particular, I live nowadays in Koreatown. And so I happen to live really close to a lot of Korean barbecue places, which are very familiar. And then it's the very physical act of having the flame in front of you. And, it's pretty smoky in there to begin with. But part of this, again, it's a problem that we've inherited, and it's going to take a lot of creative solution and thinking through intentionally as we rewrite the system. One of the things that both Erica and I really wanted to emphasize throughout this conversation, and you will notice this in our ask when we transition over to, okay, what do we do about it, is while we want to acknowledge that, yes, it is important for us to start taking, some of these steps in our homes, let's also acknowledge that we are in this much broader community, and we need to grapple with the conversation about how do we transition the restaurant industry off? How do we make sure that these benefits and rebates are not only being limited to those who are able to access them? Because as Eric alluded to, even for those of us that know how to do these things, it's incredibly confusing and it's not particularly intuitive. And then how do we also recognize in this interim period, while we're having this transition, we can acknowledge the indoor air pollution that comes with cooking with gas stoves, but also not make people feel bad for the thing that they've inherited in their apartment building or the particular cuisine that requires it at this moment, because we're all trying to make this adaptation. We're all trying to move to a different environment, and that work is difficult. Lastly, and this is the part that I'm sure a lot of you have a lot of opinions on, there's the help that the gas company, the fossil fuel industry, is not helping. They are recognizing and playing all sides. But I'll hand this over to Erica to talk about how skilled they are at that.
I do love talking about this. Like I said, they have great PR. They have a lot of money at their disposal to help muddy the waters and really polarize communities. And kind of shift the focus of the conversation. That report that I mentioned earlier specifically suggested targeting millennials and boomers, demographics that are driving the increase in demand for multifamily housing. So one generation is being priced out of homeownership through rising rents, falling wages, higher inflation, and another generation is either downsizing or aging out of their homes. So there's this increasing demand for multifamily housing. So two examples of the gas industry working behind the scenes to spread their message on these to these specific demographics. The first is in 2020, Instagram influencers were paid by the American Gas Association and the American Public Gas Association to hype cooking with gas stoves. So for a while, there was all these beautiful people on Instagram talking about how much they love their gas stoves, cooking with gas. And that was all paid for. The second thing is same year, 2020, a PR firm working for a group that's funded, it's a front group for the Southern California Gas, which is the nation's largest gas utility, tried to use social media platforms, in particular Nextdoor, to garner community opposition to electrification efforts. So they actually had PR flags go into Nextdoor and post as though they were a neighbor complaining about potential electrification. So you can see the two demographics that they were targeting there, the millennials and the boomers, or and the boomers. So I thought that was really interesting to see. They know what they're doing. They really do. And aside from their fantastic PR, they also have enough money to have an army of lobbyists to influence legislation. Could you switch slides, Michelle? So even when things go right, the fossil fuel industry can always work to change the rules of the game. So in 2019, Berkeley, California became the first city to ban gas hookups in new buildings. And that was super exciting. Other cities across the country started to follow suit. And the fossil fuel gas industry went to work promoting bills to strip the power of cities to act on climate change. So these are the 20 states right now that have preemption laws. So that means municipalities in these states are prohibited from banning fossil fuel gas hookups. They can't legislate or regulate how that's in new construction or anything. And these 20 states account for 31% of the US residential and commercial gas use. So that's also very interesting right there. And I'm going to add, with the fossil fuel industry's penchant for creating partisan division, it is not a surprise all 20 of these states have Republican legislatures, excuse me. The gas industry has donated heavily and lopsidedly to Republicans over the last 2 decades. Although, you know, shout out to Joe Manchin, who's actually like the #1 guy getting money from them. But if you look at the past 20 years, if you go to Open Secrets and you take a look at donations, in the 90s, it was almost, I wouldn't say even, but about 1/3 and 2/3 balanced. By the time we hit 2000, boy, it was about 95% Republican donations. But it's really interesting because in 1970, Republican President Richard Nixon actually created the EPA. And throughout the 70s, the League of Conservation Voters consistently scored GOP members of Congress between 30 and 40%, and Democrats between 50 and 60%, with 100% as a perfect score on environmental issues. So you can see it's certainly not historical that Republicans haven't cared about the environment. Teddy Roosevelt, I mean, it's not something that is inherently political. But in the early 1990s, Republican support for environmental issues, both for policymakers and for voters, started to dip just as countries really started coming together to talk about global warming. So President Bush, the first Bush, President George Bush, he acknowledged global warming in 1988 on the campaign trail, actually here in my state, in Michigan, on Lake Erie. And he talked about it, and he said it was going to be a centerpiece of his campaign. Throughout his tenure, he had a lot of opportunities, and he did take some actions that were important. If you're old enough to remember acid rain, that was an issue for us. He spoke at the '92 Earth Summit in Rio de Janeiro against the advice of his advisors. He had some really strong climate change denialists in his administration. And when he lost to Bill Clinton in the '92 presidential campaign, I think that might have been a real turning point for creating a real partisan divide in how the environment was viewed. You might remember that Al Gore, who was Clinton's vice president, had published Earth in the Balance. It was a bestseller. It discussed global ecological issues and how we might address them. Think tanks like the Libertarian Cato Institute, which, by the way, was co-founded by Charles Koch of Koch Industries, which is a fossil fuel industry. And lobbyists took an opportunity to make climate change a really super partisan issue. I mean, today, I was really trying to think about issues that we could call nonpartisan, and it's really hard to think of any. I would love to be able to figure out what they are. I really can't think of many, but opinions on issues related to regulating fossil fuel industry and protecting the environment have developed into truly core political beliefs for both parties, which is really it's a huge change. It's not the only issue that this happened with, but it's really pronounced. And it makes it so much easier for the fossil fuel industry to create these artificial divisions to distract from the larger issue of climate change. So Fox News will run stories about the president taking away your gas stove, and then the establishment media will run opinion pieces for and against gas stoves, because we got to get the both sides. And then suddenly nobody is talking about the elephant in the room. The use of fossil fuels is driving climate change. And climate change is already killing millions of people across the planet every single year. So now that I've left you on that high point of hope, I'm going to turn it over to Michelle to take over.
So much hope. And I also wanted to briefly acknowledge, as we talked about from the get-go, like a lot of what your specific relationship to the gas stoves, to the fossil fuel industry is really dependent on your geography. So we've intentionally been focusing on the US as sort of a case study of how the power seep through and how you can see all these different allegiances and lobbying play out on the legislator and in our laws. But I actually want to welcome anybody, folks from other geographies, to go ahead and drop in the chat too about how it plays out in your area. I know we have a substantial amount of folks from Canada and would love to hear about how you see the fossil fuel industry influencing your government. But in the spirit of not being in all doom and gloom, because there is actually quite a bit that we can do about it. It's a big task, but we can fundamentally change both the culture and the way that we talk to one another. We can change our homes, and we can also take collective action, because ultimately the collective action is what's going to help us change this whole system. So let's start by addressing some of the things that we can do in our own particular homes. There's a few immediate actions that we can take to reduce air pollution for our area. This is a particular note if you happen to have somebody in your family member who's particularly sensitive towards asthma or other related respiratory issues. We wanted to also acknowledge that this is very dependent, as we have said over and over again, but it's worth saying once again, depending on the layout of your home, your regional weather patterns, and of course your financial circumstances, because it can be expensive to do all these things. But if you can, ventilate as much as possible. That includes using the hood over your stove. That also includes, weather permitting, keeping windows open as is appropriate. There has also been a little bit of budding research on simple air purifiers that are relatively inexpensive, can also help reduce some, not all of them, but some of the pollution that is associated with the gas stoves. And of course, if you are able to and excited and ready to do it, go ahead and replace your gas stove. We wanted to specifically mention that we did have this monumental piece of legislation that helped offset some of the cost. We also are aware that it's a different system in Canada, but there's also some grants related to that you can also access to help with the cost of that. So we went ahead and dropped the link in the chat as well if you wanted to read up on those. But again, as much as possible, do those things. But now I want to introduce another lovely all-star on our team, Anne Pernick, who will talk us through a little bit of the actions that we take together. And one thing that perhaps we've been beating around the bush, but I'll say explicitly now, is part of the reason why gas stoves is such a lightning rod for this moment. Even though, as some folks have pointed out, some of the bigger sources of climate pollution might be your heater, your space heater, etc. It is a very intimate connection because it is related to cooking. So it kind of provides this entry point. So right now we're in this particular moment in time, as my colleague Nathan likes to say, where it's in the zeitgeist. People are talking about this as it relates to climate change. So we have a unique opportunity to actually take that energy and make some change. But if we don't trust our federal government, what can we do? Anne, can you tell us?
I would love to, Michelle. It's so nice to be here with you all. Thanks everyone for joining. Give me a holler if something happens with my sound, and I'll turn my video off if there's a problem with our connection. So first of all, I want to say that we've got people on this call today who are part of our Safe Cities Organizing Network for Advocates and part of our NEOS network for local government leaders. And for you and others on this call, some of these steps may be things that you're already doing on your own or with Safe Cities. And but I want to know that for everybody, we're going to have an action step that you can take in real time with us today that we're excited to share with you. And the first thing that I want to do in terms of things that we can do collectively is say, speak up, talk with your friends and family and your local government leaders about this. So it's great that you're part of this conversation today, and keeping this conversation going is really important. So talking with these different people in your life and different leaders in your community, including elected officials and staff and equity and sustainability commission members on councils, et cetera, about why electrification is important and why methane and other fossil fuels in our buildings do not make sense. Also talk about all the different things that have come up in this discussion today about how the industry got us sold on gas and is using false and misleading claims to keep us on it, about how we can make our homes safe if we do have gas stoves. Make sure to talk about that because people need to know what to do right now, and talk about how the switch from fossil fuels to electricity has different kinds of costs for people, financial, cultural, and more. And we need to make this as easy as possible for everyone. So keep this conversation going, including all the nuance of it. And it's been a growth curve for me, and I want to share that. And I'm learning more and more every day about how how nuanced it is, and really excited to be doing a better job myself in how I talk about it. Another thing that we can do is change the rules, and that's a lot of what we work on at Safe Cities. And again, I know many people are already doing that in their communities. So there are policies being introduced and passed all over the US and Canada to electrify buildings. Many of these focus on new construction, and Erica took us through a bit of the history of those policies, starting with Berkeley. There's also a newer policy area that is about electrifying existing buildings, although actually the first major law on existing buildings passed shortly after Berkeley's. But it is one that has been slower to develop, of course, because it's got a lot of complication and nuance and potentially expense in it. But both are really important. We don't want only the people using newer homes and buildings to benefit from electrification, and leave the people in existing buildings, including lower income people and renters, stuck with the health and safety dangers, and also the rising costs as the industry leans on existing buildings to keep making money while newer buildings electrify. So we're working with local advocates and local government leaders to pass both kinds of policies. I feel like probably the best thing for me to do is maybe paste a few examples in the chat. But we talked about Berkeley. New York City has Local Law 97, which is about capping emissions from existing buildings, larger existing buildings. Vancouver, BC has passed policies on both new and existing buildings. And Sacramento, California, when they passed a REACH code, they also passed a resolution to say that we need to develop a roadmap for our existing buildings. So they passed a REACH code on new construction, and they said, but we need to do this at the same time. We need to be looking ahead to existing buildings. So with all of that in mind, we've got an action you can take right now to reach out to your local government leaders and ask them to move building electrification in your communities. And I think we're going to share those links. Oh, and also I was going to say the best place actually to see all the policies I've talked about is on the Safe Cities map. And so on our website, you can look up electrification policies and you can see all the ones I talked about and more. We've got links to most of the policies, and we're working on adding those all the time. So I'll make sure that that link is in the chat after we talk with you about these actions. So you can use these links if you're in the USA or in Canada. There's a link for each country. And I'm just going to give everybody a minute to take that action and send that message to your local government leaders. It will automatically load up the council members, and you can send the message in support of building electrification right where you are.
And maybe to get a little bit of group energy, how about folks pull out their phones or laptop or whatever your preferred mechanism is, send it, and then put a little like happy face emoji, whatever you want, after you've sent it in the chat. So we're going to pause and let y'all take this action right now. And I'm going to do it too, so you can see me. Would you look at that? This is such sophisticated technology. If you haven't reached the page yet, once you input your information, it'll pull up your local representatives. So for me, that's the city council members of Los Angeles. Ooh. Hey, Nathan, it sounds like maybe the Canada link isn't working. Could we troubleshoot that?
Yeah, let me take a look at that right now.
Thank you. excited to see people saying that they did the action. It's case sensitive. Thanks, Angela, helping us troubleshoot in real time.
I wonder if we have large contingents from any specific place where some council members are going to say, gosh, I just got this big wave of emails tonight.
I don't know. I feel like we have a few Montana folks. I don't know how many, a few of those could overwhelm them, those smaller city councils.
So for folks who may have been maybe having trouble with the Canada link, it's really important that you go to the Canada specific page, which is the BE-CANA. And that should take you to the page, because if you try and do the Canada, you try and put in a Canadian address on the US page, it won't look it up for you. If you're still having trouble, let me know and I can try and troubleshoot it further, but sometimes that's...
Oh, Nathan, I think you're underwater. But I think what Nathan was saying, that you can go ahead and direct message Nathan. That is Nathan Taft, if you need some more support with that tech. But so excited to see y'all putting it, as well as Victoria also put another link for the Canadian folks. And the last thing that I wanted to say before we go ahead and close the presentation section, and I'll explain why, is we want to invite all of y'all to actually join us in this movement, because if you weren't already aware, Safe Cities is actually a collective of different folks from all over the country, all over the US and Canada, who are taking these joint actions together. We wanted to name specifically, as I've said a couple different times, is that this fight looks very different depending on what geography you are. We recognize that this sort of campaign, this sort of move towards electrification to pull out gas stoves looks very different in Maine versus Seattle versus Montana, and don't even get us started on Texas. And part of the reason that we are organized as a network is to acknowledge that Stand doesn't have all the answers. Safe Cities doesn't have all the answers, but some of y'all do. And so part of the idea is that y'all are able to kind of share resources with one another and support one another with that work. In addition to the work that I do with the organizing network, Ann Pernick, who you just heard from, leads the network of elected officials, which does a similar thing, where it's folks at the city council municipality level that are sharing policies, that are sharing strategies. And so the organizing work is a complement to that, and when we're sharing strategies amongst advocates. So go ahead and see that link as well. But one of the core tenets of the organizing network is that we don't have all the answers. So with that, I will actually stop sharing screen, and we are going to field some of the questions that have come up throughout the conversation, partially because we want to unearth some of those tension points that y'all are experiencing on the ground. So I believe, oh, here we go. I believe Nathan and Victoria and Logan were gathering questions. So I'm wondering if you wanted to float any particular ones for us to address first. And I will bring everybody down here. See.
Michelle, I direct message them to you, but I can drop them again for everyone to see if that's helpful.
Yeah.
Okay, great. Here's some questions that came up earlier that we're going to revisit.
So let's see. Question for Erica, and let us know, Erica, if you don't have the direct answer. How does the history of propane use track with the history of gas use, if you happen to know?
That's a great question. I don't have a lot of statistics on that, but in rural areas, propane gas is still very prevalent. When you don't have gas lines running out there, propane is very heavily relied on in those areas. So I think that's a good question, but I think it also is really dependent on location.
In the event that somebody else on the webinar knows, you can go ahead and flag that for us in the chat and we can get you off mute. Or Anne, I don't know. Anne, you seem to know a lot of things.
I do not know really exactly the right answer to this question, but it made me think about a friend of mine has a house in a city in Oregon called Maupin, and it's one of the cities, as Erica noted, that just they never plumbed the gas out to it. They never piped it out. And so I think that there is definitely propane use there, but there's also just a lot of all electrical, like all of my friends' appliances are electric. And I like to bring up this example because it's a more rural part of Oregon. I'm in a more urban part of Oregon. And I like to, with folks, especially who think that, you know, that this is just something that that urban people are interested in, point out that there is a rural city in my state where there is no gas. There's no methane gas plumbed into houses.
I knew you would have something to say. Victoria, what's our next question? Question, owners of multifamily complexes have lower liability issues with electric appliances, right? I'm not sure. Erica or Ann?
I'm not sure about that either in terms of liability. I will say in terms of construction, it's cheaper to have one utility line run than two. For larger buildings, higher rise, it costs a lot more to do gas up, the piping, the fittings, the clause, you know, where those storage for those pipes, and I don't know all the terms, but all that cost money. The size is slightly different for gas versus electric. So, you know, in terms of liability, I'm not sure, but in terms of cost, for sure, if you're doing new construction, just doing solely electric is substantially cheaper than adding gas.
Mm. And it sounds like some folks are liability in terms of like dangers and not having an open flame. I see Jim saying not having to worry blow up with the leaks. That is a actual one of the ways that I've experienced this issue quite a bit. Mexican, my parents are from Mexico City, and so my mom was actually in the big earthquake. And then for those that follow the news, happy to know earthquake history in Mexico. It's actually same date 3 times now. And every single time, part of the reason that's so scary is because there's the gas hookups. And so there'll be gas leaks, and that ends up being a substantial cause of death because of that. So I live in earthquake country, so that is something that I am aware of. Let's see. Oh, no, I lost it. Logan says, another question. Lately, I've been hearing some buzz about cooking with induction stoves from Chef. Can anyone who has an induction stove talk about what it's like? That's a great question.
How exciting is that? So for Christmas this year, I told my husband that what I really, really wanted was for us to give each other an induction stove, which sounds really super boring. And I think if I was like 8, like my daughter, I'd be like, that you are the most boring person I have ever met in my entire life. But that's what I really wanted. I've been working a lot on climate issues. I thought it was something that we could do, that we could afford to do. And so no, we don't have to. Well, we have a separate oven, and then we have a cooktop. So when we moved into our house, that's how it was already set up. So we replaced the cooktop with an induction cooktop. So we don't have like the full range. We just have the cooktop piece. It is different. It takes some time to get adjusted to. But I will say I love to cook, and you know, it's definitely different. You know, like Michelle said, culturally, you know, I did used to throw a tortilla right on the grate, and I can't do that anymore, but I have a cast iron comal, and I got to say that thing heats up so fast and so evenly on my induction stovetop that I really, truly just love it. And cast iron, and like, I mean, we have cast iron that works so well for us on there. So in terms of also like safety for, I mean, my daughter's old enough that I don't have to worry about her accidentally touching the stovetop, but it only heats like, so if you accidentally turned it on, say you turned it on and you turned on one of the burners and you walked away, but you forgot to put anything on top of it, it will turn itself off. The other thing is, unless you actually put a magnetic pot on top of it, it won't even create heat. It won't even work. So you have to have those 2 parts to do it. So it's a single case study. It's been a learning curve, but I've been surprised. My whole life I've cooked on a gas stove. So this was truly a big, I've never, ever had an electric stove. So it was a big change for me, but even as somebody who loves to cook, it's worked out pretty well. It's only been what, 2 months? God, it's only 2 months since Christmas.
If y'all want to have a Erica cooking webinar live stream, I feel like you should drop that in the chat and we can get that.
Voluntold. I've got voluntold.
Another thing that I'm seeing floating from the chat, Linda Golly has a comment about labor unions which install gas are opposed to anti-gas laws. And I feel I do want to kind of talk a little bit about that because it runs within this theme of having a transition and how difficult that is. I will also preface, Victoria, I know that in the past you've had some interactions with unions, so I would love it if you wanted to come off mute and talk about this as well. But I mention that only because this kind of falls within the theme of energy transitions are hard. When whole subsets of the economy were created in such a way that they're extremely dependent on the livelihoods for that particular industry, it makes a lot of sense that they would be, pretty upset about it. And it is a piece that I think us in the environmental space are very cognizant about. And when it is appropriate, we try to bring unions into the conversation and see if there can be an effort to do trainings in other skills or related. But Victoria, I'm curious if you have anything to add.
Yeah, I mean, I think that, with any type of local policy that's being passed, it's just really important as it is to consult with folks who are most impacted, to have workers to be part of the conversation. And so that's just going to get ahead and make sure that you're not only building robust support for the policy that's being passed, but make sure that workers actually are weighing in on what they think types of solutions are going to be most appropriate. And that, I've seen this play out in some cities in Washington state for sure. And that there's also just remembering that builders aren't a monolith. There's steel workers, there's plumbers, and they all might have different positions on this type of a policy. And so there might be natural alliances, and there might also be, opportunities where you are disagreeing, but at least to have good communication pathways and not fall into the same tropes of jobs versus the environment, which we see oftentimes, and try and get out ahead of that.
Mm-hmm. Let's see. I apologize for going out of order. It's a little bit tricky on my little laptop, but I see a question from Jennifer that I'm curious if Anne has any thoughts. Question, looking at real estate sites, I see newer homes with electric heat pumps. Yay. Oh no, it got lost. But gas stoves. How can we educate builders to meet consumer demand, which hopefully will flip to no gas hookups? I'm curious if you have any experience with this since you work in the building electrification realm.
I will just say that this is an area that the NEOS network for local government leaders that I facilitate at Safe Cities, that they are requesting more information that they can use to educate builders. So I don't have anything to hand. I will say that more education is needed, and that there's definitely been, I think, a lot of work on the side of the opposition to kind of get to them first. And so I see Erica nodding. I don't know if you have anything you want to add on that. And then I wanted to touch base on what Jim McPhail noted in the chat next, Michelle, if that's okay.
Yeah, go for it.
Oh,
But Erica, I wanted to hear Erica first on with the builders.
Oh no, I mean, I think it's hard to influence builders without actually having people, saying out loud and making the purchases of homes without gas hookups, or making a demand for that. I think I think if somebody has a planned community, if they're already doing a planned community, they've already planned their utilities out. So it's getting in early and having those conversations. I mean, that's also a good opportunity in terms of advocacy. Is, we have folks moving in who want to build new homes, and we would love to see stuff that was electrified. Let's figure out some creative ways we can do that.
Yeah, and hopefully the way that this latest stove study and the reaction to it has just gotten into so much more of the mass media will help, and so that you'll just have more and more people saying that that this isn't the kind of stove that they want either. I wanted to note, I saw your message in the chat, Jim, about how a lot of the energy is being in different places is not being generated. The electricity is not being generated in a clean and renewable way. And I didn't know if you meant that then should we worry about electrification But a lot of people bring that up. It's like, well, if we're just switching to electricity, but it's still ultimately fossil fuels, what do we do? So the good news is that the grid is getting cleaned up in both countries. And so over time, the electricity that you are going to be using is going to get cleaner and cleaner. So don't make your decision based on the electricity mix in your community right now, because it's getting better. Pretty much all over the place as far as I know. For instance, we have this note in our briefing note about communities getting off methane gas that, and this note is about heat pumps, that heat pumps are so energy efficient that they lead to lower carbon emissions even when electricity generated from today's current grid is the fuel source. So in terms of at least the heat pump appliance, and I would expect this would be the same for induction cooktops too, because they are also so efficient that they are, you're using less energy overall than you would. And so it's already the right choice to go to all electric versus using a gas appliance, even if your grid is not completely clean. The briefing note goes on to say we can't afford to wait for a completely clean grid while installing equipment that locks buildings into using methane gas for decades, and we don't need to. Renewable energy is a substantial source for electricity today, and the supply is projected to steadily increase. And then the briefing notes got some details about what the mix is like in both Canada and the US. So I'll make sure we share that. It might have already been shared. And yeah, thanks for the good note, Jim.
We have a grand total of 3 minutes left, and I do see quite a bit of chat in the conversation. I am curious. I would love somebody to speak a little bit about some of these Canadian pieces. I'm wondering if Angela is still on. I saw you put some really interesting bits in there if you wanted to speak anything into the room. Slash if my tech person can find out if Angela's still here.
Yeah, I'm still here. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. Yeah, so I'm in Ottawa, Ontario, and recently there's been this motion floated that for human rights reasons, for mobility challenged people, there should be backup generators for all multi-unit residential buildings. We've had some extreme weather with power outages, and more is expected. So from an equity perspective, that rings like a good idea. But then if you think about every single multi-unit building investing in more fossil fuel infrastructure, this is huge and horrendous. So I'm wondering if you see alternatives that are cost effective and feasible.
I'm curious if Anne or Erica have any immediate responses.
I wish that I did. I know that that's also been an issue here in the States that's been really arisen in the disability community. As we see climate change continue to get worse, we're going to continue to see more severe weather that has really serious long-term impacts on communities. Anne was just mentioning in the comments earlier about how there was folks without power or water for days. And those are really serious issues. I think those are areas where it's important for us to collaborate. I talk about intersectionality. I mean, I talked about how that, inequities, all of these things are tied together. So I also want to give a shout out to Chris and apologize. We did not have closed captioning tonight, and that's on us. And I apologize because that is something that I talk about, and it's not something I live tonight. So, but intersectionality between communities. So when we talk about energy policy, we also have to think about how those things impact different communities, including the disability community. And I know, for instance, when there was this whole talk about banning straws, and a lot of folks in the disability community was like, wait a minute, that is something that's really important to us. So you're talking about banning something that we need for daily living. And so I think it's really important to think about those things and how they intersect and what can we do to lift that up and fight for those in our communities to say maybe it's not just necessarily building owners, but government. We've gotten a lot of money from COVID relief and all these different funds. Let's find ways to use those to support people in communities.
Mm-hmm. And I think one final thing I would add to this is this, as I had mentioned earlier, like a lot of this is kind of uncharted territory and it's tricky. And that's part of the reason that this campaign is structured in the way that it is that we want to acknowledge that your stakeholders will vary quite a bit substantially based on where you are. And unfortunately, a lot of environmental spaces have focused far too long on urban landscapes, but there is a huge and difficult question of what do you do for rural landscapes where there are emergencies and there's no other piece out. We are at 6:01. Who knew that we could have such a fun hour talking about our energy grid system and getting off of fossil fuels? I think I kind of knew when I saw the registrations coming in. But once again, I wanted to thank you all for being here in this space. Thank you for holding this conversation and being open to sort of the perspectives and sort of contextualizing where we are. And also thank you for digging into these hard questions of how do we change fundamentally the system that we're in. One more invitation, if you haven't already, go ahead and sign up for the organizing network, because if you're into this, you will find your people there. They are equally as jazzed and want to dig into the nitty-bitty policy details and are excited for it. So with that, I wanted to formally close. I will stick around for a few extra minutes if anybody wanted to chat. I'm sure some of my colleagues will also as well, but thank you once again for joining and have a lovely night.